Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Joe Tyrrell and welcome back to The Runoff, the GP blog podcast. We have a standout leader at the top of the championship as Charles Leclerc stormed to victory in Australia and Max Verstappen suffered another retirement. The terrible Mercedes, well, they're currently second in both championships. Myself, Cam and Toby will recap the first Australian Grand Prix since 2019. We'll pick our winners and losers and then we'll look ahead to Imola and the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. This is the 2022 season, episode 4.
Michael and John, Get in there, Lewis.
George Russell, now qualified Mr. Hamilton.
You are the world champion.
Well, Cam and Toby, it was an early start this morning, but how are you feeling now? We're recording 12 hours after the race. Cameron, I'll come to you first. What did you make of the race?
Yeah, Joe, I thought it was pretty good for Albert Park. I think the changes to the circuit worked. I think it was more entertaining Australian Grand Prix than we've had in recent years. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. Obviously, an early start, dozing off a little bit towards the end. But no, it was entertaining and I thought it was a good race.
And Toby, what did you make of it?
I wasn't stupid enough like Cam to actually wake up and watch it. But from watching the highlights and looking at all the post-race reactions and all that, it didn't seem to be as bad as people were kind of expecting it. One thing I mentioned before we started recording was that it's the first race of the season. I know there's only been 3 now, but it's the first race of the season, which kind of emulated the results from the races we saw last season. I think we could overall say it was a success.
Yeah, well, I tried and failed pretty miserably. I've caught up with all the highlights. But Toby, you mentioned there that it sort of emulated last season's results. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, the final race positions looked very similar to last year. So Ferrari, Red Bull and Mercedes at the top. And then McLaren had a very strong race and found themselves 5th and 6th. With Lando just edging Daniel Ricciardo. So it's just it seems as though for this race at least, it's reminiscent of last year and the battles we saw there with the main leaders and then the midfield teams as well.
Cameron, what do you make of Toby's point there?
Yeah, I can see where it's coming from. Obviously, it seems as though, if anything, obviously Ferrari and Mercedes have sort of just switched around Red Bull where they were. McLaren, 4th best, as they were last year, and sort of Haas dropping back down after a really encouraging start to this year. So I can certainly see where the point comes from. I am not too sure if it's something that will continue for the rest of the year or if it's simply just because of the Albert Park track. It may simply be circuit dependent. And if that is the case, it may change in Imola back to what we've seen in the first 2 races of the season. But it'll be interesting to see because McLaren, for one, will be hoping that it isn't circuit dependent and this is the start of their road to recovery.
2 of the teams you mentioned there, Haas and McLaren, both have had very different fortunes at the start of the season. However, this race, it saw them enjoy very contrasting fortunes to what they have experienced. Toby, McLaren, much improved. Do you think it's very heavily circuit dependent?
I wouldn't say very heavily circuit dependent, but I would agree with what Cam said, is that it could be the fact that it is Albert Park more than that they're already hitting their road to recovery. I think it's far too early to say whether it is just heavily dependent on that, but it looks good because obviously they had a very strong weekend that they'll probably be quite happy with, but whether or not Imola will be able to see it, I'm not too sure.
Judging by what Toby said, Cameron, it's not alarm bells for Haas and celebration for McLaren just yet.
No, not at all. I think that Haas could quite easily sort of regain this. I mean, we even saw it last year, teams fluctuating between points and not scoring points quite a lot in that midfield. So I don't think it's a cause for concern for Haas, and I don't think McLaren will get carried away with themselves. I think they'll both take this weekend on the chin. They'll move on pretty quickly and focus changes to Imola because it will be a different race. It's a completely different circuit, and they won't I don't think they'll dwell too much on what happened this weekend.
Well, we're a couple of minutes into the podcast already, lads, and we've not even mentioned the race winner. Charles Leclerc, emphatic is the word I would use. Dominant from start to finish, really, all weekend. He secured yet another win with a bonus point for the fastest lap. Is his lead almost too much for anyone else to achieve now? Like, it's a big lead at the top because George Russell is now second in the standings.
It is a big lead, but I think it's too early in the season to say anything. Yeah, I think it is too early to say anything. There is a chance that it could be, but I mean, 2 DNFs by Leclerc and 2 wins by Verstappen, and he's right back in it. So I don't know. It's one of those where you can toss it up out there and everyone will have contrasting opinions. So it'll be interesting to hear what Cam says.
Yeah, I think you've made a good point there. I think the DNFs is something to look out for. Obviously, Verstappen's had two DNFs now, so we can't really judge too much on what his pace is looking like this season. The one race he finished, he won. So is that something to say? I'm not too sure, but I think Leclerc, based on how quick Ferrari look, is starting to build that kind of lead where you think, is he going to, I mean, we're 3 races in, we've got so many left, but he's starting to look dominant and looking like he is ready to win that championship. But, you know, we're so early in the season that Ferrari could easily drop off. I mean, Red Bull could bring some upgrades, Mercedes could bring upgrades. If you like, say, George Russell's P2, Mercedes could quite easily bring the upgrades that we expect. We think that they will towards the end of the season, and suddenly Mercedes have got the quickest car. So Leclerc's by no means wrapped it up at all. I don't think anyone thinks he has, but he's certainly impressed and well on his way to a title challenge.
I think the problem the other teams have is Leclerc looks so quick and so reliable. He's not just quick, he's got the reliability as well. And Red Bull, they have the pace, but they don't have that reliability at the minute. Mercedes haven't got the package. So if they continue on that path sort of thing, it'll be they really do look like at the minute, to me anyway, that they are too good to beat at the minute. That's just how I feel. But we'll get on to our winners and losers of the Australian Grand Prix now. Cam, I'm going to start with you. Your winners are 2 drivers this week.
Yes, the first, very obvious. Someone's got to say it, so I'll do the honours. Charles Leclerc, dominant throughout. We've said the word emphatic, and it truly was that. There was a period where he potentially could have lost it, but no, I don't think he was ever in a position to not win the race. I think he was dominant all weekend, really. Put it on pole, won the race, got the fastest lap, job done, goes home happy, and his title charge is sort of going as well as it possibly could, really. So he's certainly a winner, and he'll be going home happy, especially with what happened with Carlos Sainz. His teammate Ferrari needed a strong result from Leclerc, and he delivered that. My second's a little bit more interesting than just saying the race winner, and that's Alex Albon. No surprise to the people who've listened to this podcast before. I am an Alex Albon fan, but I think even if I wasn't, I'd put him in this category. But just because he started P20 dead last because of the grid penalty he served following the last race in Saudi Arabia for his collision with Lance Stroll, started P20 and finished P10 in the points, and I think in a Williams, that's pretty impressive because Williams have looked the slowest or the second slowest car this season. So I think that Albon deserves his flowers because that is a pretty, I mean, you'd be praising someone like that. I mean, Lewis Hamilton, when he in Jeddah, he started, because he got knocked out in Q1 and managed to get 10th. And Albon's done a similar thing, starting even further back in a slower car. So I think he really deserves that. Obviously, he went all but 1 lap on the hard tyres he started before pitting in that last lap for soft tyres. But even with the safety cars, he'd built up enough of a gap to P11 to pit and still come out ahead of Guan Yu Zhou and get points. First points for Williams, first points back in F1 for Albon. And I think maybe slightly went under the radar, I think, the performance, because P20 to P10 is no mean feat, especially in a Williams.
Yeah, fair play to Alex Albon, because it's not been an ideal start to the season for Williams. They've struggled with their pace once again and have looked like that they might be slipping back down the grid to where they have been in previous years. But fair play, Alex Albon is a deserved winner, and he is a deserved 10th place finisher. So well done, Alex Albon. Toby, I'll come to you. You've gone for 2 teams rather than 2 drivers.
Yeah, so my winners for this weekend are Mercedes and McLaren. Obviously, McLaren got their kind of first decent weekend, shall we say, where it looks like they're back on a similar pace to what they were last season. 18 points, Lando getting 10 and Danny Rick getting 8. I think it's just one of them where, as a team, they'll probably be very happy just because they're finally scoring points and getting somewhere decent. They're up to 4th overall now in the championship. Obviously, it's very early, but they're kind of back up, moving up a bit, kind of because people were viewing them as, well, everyone knew they had quite a poor start in the first 2 Grand Prix. And then Mercedes, obviously it was George's first podium. It was a bit lucky, shall we say, because Verstappen had to retire. But then again, he still got the podium and got the points. He's up to 2nd in the championship now behind only Leclerc, which I know Cam mentioned, and I kind of agreed with. It's really weird to see because we're so used to him being kind of towards the bottom. However, Mercedes are still 39 points off Ferrari, so you can see it as a win for this weekend, but overall still kind of there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of bittersweet for Mercedes because they are getting these positive results. You think Hamilton in Bahrain, you think George Russell this week. Saudi Arabia wasn't a disaster for Russell. It wasn't great for Hamilton, but they are still second in the championship, albeit with Red Bull's reliability issues. So it's probably quite bittersweet for them at the minute. Wouldn't you agree, Cam?
Yeah. Obviously, with this race, Russell really well. It really should have been Hamilton's podium. Obviously, Russell pitted under the safety car, whereas Hamilton had already pitted. So Russell managed to get ahead of his teammate. But yeah, bittersweet. I think it's more sweet than bitter for Mercedes because they've still not found the pace, but they've managed to get third and fourth, which is really impressive. And Russell in P2 in the Drivers' Championship is a great start for him because I think he maybe would have thought that that would be the case heading into the season, but I don't think after preseason testing he'd be thinking that was the case. So yeah, Mercedes still need to find pace. They certainly do, but things are looking better as the weeks go on, and I think that a decent finish this season could well be on the cards.
The Australian Grand Prix wasn't without its losers, though. Cam, I'll start with you again. Max Verstappen is your loser this week, and it's fairly understandable.
Yeah, Max, through no fault of his own, a second DNF in 3 races. It's just unfortunate for him because it seems to be happening more to him than to Sergio. He's just thrown away. He hasn't thrown away, but the Red Bull reliability has thrown away some good points. And I think Max Verstappen would not have expected 2 DNFs in 3 races. It sort of reminds you of his earlier Red Bull days when that was becoming an issue, which is sort of one of the reasons why Danny Rick left. Obviously, the Verstappen factor was one of them, but also the fact that Red Bull, Ricardo in particular, just kept having sort of DNFs through reliability issues. And the fact that Verstappen is 6th in the championship is not something that he'd have expected after 3 races, and something that Red Bull need to look over because it's concerning. And obviously, Checo getting P2 is a great result, but for Max, he'll be wanting to bounce back because this weekend has been one to forget.
Yep, another weekend to forget for Verstappen, and that's 2 out of 3 races now he's DNF'd with engine problems. But Toby, arguably the only man to have a worse weekend than Max Verstappen, was Carlos Sainz in the Ferrari. Another contrast to his teammate, but it wasn't a good week for him, was it?
No, I'm going to keep it kind of short and sweet. And I wrote a few notes down for the things I wanted to say when it came to winners and losers. And the one thing I noted for Sainz was that it looks bad when comparing it to his teammate, just because of how strong Charles Leclerc is doing in the Ferrari car. Obviously, it didn't start too well with qualifying. It wasn't really his fault because of the red flag, but then again, he still qualified 9th. So it was obviously going to be hard for him in comparison to Charles, but then retired during the race. I believe it was in the first 3 laps. So it's just, I don't really have many other things to say apart from it's one of those to forget for him.
Yep, a bit of a stinker for Carlos Sainz. But Cam, you wanted to give a special mention. He's not a winner, he's not a loser, but you wanted to give a special mention to Fernando Alonso.
Yeah, he's my second loser, if you will, just because Fernando Alonso could quite easily, I think, have scored a podium this weekend, and he ended in P17. Obviously crashed in Q3 in qualifying, so couldn't set a time, but throughout the weekend, he was looking pretty rapid in that Alpine. I think Alpine would be disappointed to just come away with a 7th place finish, to be honest, given the fact they were probably the third quickest team this weekend. Obviously, Alonso, he looked better than Ocon this weekend, and I think if Lando Norris obviously started 4th, and I think that it's feasible to say that if Alonso hadn't crashed in Q3, he would have been lining up on the 2nd row. And if that had been the case, and Verstappen, what happened to Verstappen did, then yeah, I think that he quite easily was quicker than the Mercedes. At least in qualifying he was. And I think that, yeah, it's a shame for him. Obviously he pitted right at the end for another stop, which put him down from sort of P13 or something like that, I think it was, to P17. But for someone who I think did have podium capabilities this weekend, it's been one to forget for Alonso, who will be ruining his qualifying mistake.
Yeah, I feel a bit for Alpine because I think their form is going under the radar at the minute. They look pretty good. And Alonso this weekend has looked rapid. So, yeah, He is a bit of a loser, but he won't go down on our official list. We will now look forward to Imola and the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. Well, guys, Imola is back on the calendar for the third consecutive year. It's back. It's thrown up some pretty good races in the last 2 years, in my opinion. Last season, we had that epic duel at the start between Verstappen and Hamilton. We had Bottas and Russell colliding. A huge crash, arguably one of the biggest of the season. So are we set for another good race?
I think it's hard to predict. Obviously, the big crash between Bottas and Russell last year was maybe down to the weather conditions.
Pretty heavily down to the
Yeah. But obviously, we saw Lando Norris get a podium last year at Imola as well. So I think that was a race which kind of just surprised everyone, and the surprise is what kind of made the race a good one, and the factors that kind of came into it. So I don't really know, especially with how the 3 races have gone so far this season. They've all gone very differently, with teams like we mentioned earlier performing better at different circuits, like McLaren and Haas. So maybe it's just me being a bit dumb when it comes to my knowledge, but I'm one of the fans that is very unsure how this weekend's going to go.
You're staying reserved, Toby. No, I think that's fair enough, because if I remember to last year, Imola was good and it had its moments, but there were also some mediocre parts. So I don't blame you. Cam, it's fair to say that Charles Leclerc goes in as heavy favourite.
Yeah, for sure. Given his form and Red Bull's reliability problems, I think Leclerc will be looking at that as just another chance to extend his lead, really. Obviously, as Toby said, it is hard to predict. Last year was made pretty good, I think, by the rain. Obviously, you mentioned the crash. I think Hamilton chasing down Norris was pretty exciting, the battle they had. Obviously, rain's the great equaliser, as it's called in Formula One, and it made the race far more interesting than it would have been, I should say. So I'd love a bit of rain in Imola again if it wants to deliver that. But if not, hopefully I'd like to see a similar scenario to Sainz qualifying in 9th, but obviously not a DNF. But I'd like to see a quicker car try and come through the field, because otherwise I think it could be a Verstappen, Leclerc, Perez and Sainz sort of drive away from the rest of the field, really.
That always would make it more interesting. I quickly want to touch on Mercedes' fortunes. Mercedes, after the first race, the first sort of rumor I heard about their upgrades was that possibly Imola could be the destination for their first set of upgrades. Not really heard much about it since. So are we still expecting them to be 5th and 6th, Toby?
Yes, but I wouldn't be surprised if we saw them on the podium. I don't think they're going to be fighting for race wins just yet because of how quick the Ferrari is and how in form Charles Leclerc is. But I think there's small things which they can upgrade, which could probably bridge the gap to Sainz or Perez, but I'm not too sure.
Cam, do you agree? It's maybe a step too far for Mercedes just yet?
Yeah, I mean, it's all down to we'll see in FP1, really, at least get a base idea. But I think one thing that is interesting is I think Mercedes are doing a really good job of picking up points when they're not looking great. And I think one of the ways they're doing that is obviously through Red Bull's reliability, but also they're not really fighting with other teams. It seems like Hamilton and Russell are pretty even. They're going to be following one another. Whereas the Red Bulls and Ferrari, hasn't happened yet, but there is potential for a crash, for a collision, because they're fighting so hard at the front. And I think Mercedes have done well this season at just picking up the remains. And I think I wouldn't be surprised if going into turn 1 at Imola, like we saw last year with Hamilton and Verstappen, there could be contact. So maybe it's Leclerc and Verstappen and there's contact between them, and they maybe obviously a DNF will have to pit that lap, and then obviously it opens up the door for another podium. So I think Mercedes could well be looking at another podium potentially if things go their way.
You made a good point there. It's the sign of champions that they're picking up points even when they're not performing. And I think at the minute, they're keeping themselves out of danger and they're managing to get some good results because they would know full well they're not the quickest car on the grid anymore. Lads, we'll finish off this episode with your predictions for the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. Toby, I'm going to come to you first. Your race winner, your pole position, and your surprise of the weekend.
Right. So I've been quite bold with my other predictions for the 3 Grand Prix that have happened. So I'm going to be very boring and basic with this one. And I'm going to say pole and win Charles Leclerc. I just think it's a very safe bet, and I'd put my money on that. Sorry for being boring, but I can't help it this weekend. And then my surprise, I'm going to go George Russell second.
Surprised you've picked it.
Imagine my shock. Cameron?
I'll go a little bit more out there. I'll agree with you that Leclerc will get pole. I think it's worth remembering that Checo did beat Max in qualifying for the first time at Imola last year. But I'll go on. I'll say Checo will win the race. I think Leclerc and Verstappen could have problems, potentially an incident at turn 1. And the surprise of the weekend will be, I'm going to say Esteban Ocon to come 4th.
Great shout. I love that. Well, I'm going for Lewis Hamilton for all 3. Lads, thank you for joining me this week. I hope you're not too tired. It's about time you get off and have some rest. But from myself, Cam and Toby, we will see you all soon.
Michael, let's go.
No, Mike, that was so not right.
Get in there, Lewis.
George Russell.